Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
Privileged to talk here at Manthan. I've heard a lot about it over the years. So, always wanted to come and talk about some of my research. Today I'm going to talk about migration and pandemics. And as Ajay rightly pointed out, last year we did not have one crisis, but we had two crises. We had the pandemic crisis, which was external. It was exogenous shock, as we researchers like to say. It's something not really, policy mandated. And pandemics have happened in the past. But what was really unprecedented was the migration crisis. And so is there really a way to understand the relationship between pandemics and migration? Because obviously, when you think about it, all pandemics require some migration. You can't have a pandemic if there's no migration, because you need to have some disease carrier, whether it's human beings or some disease vector. And so pandemic management or pandemic curtailment actually does require some curtailment of migration, right? But how, when, these are the kind of policy questions. I don't think anybody's really arguing that, do not clamp down on migration at all. But how do you go about doing it? Is there a method in that particular madness? Could we have completely avoided what happened last year? And of course, the first answer is that yes, we could have avoided what happened last year, for the simple reason that we were probably the only country which faced such a big crisis. So obviously, what were other countries doing? That is the first lesson to learn. That is, why did other countries which also have internal migration not get such a massive migration crisis? But what I'm going to do today is kind of take you through a historical tour of both migration and pandemics, because pandemics have not really, we kind of, pandemics have, we kind of say 2020 was an unprecedented year and so on. But as I point out in my recent book, between 1817 and 1920, India was ravaged by not one, but three major pandemics, in which India was the epicenter of mortality in all three of them. There was cholera, there was plague, and there was influenza. Cholera for nearly a century in outbreaks virtually every year in some part of India. You had plague between 1894 and about 1920s, and then you had the influenza pandemic, which is in a way comparable to the current one because it was a virus-led pandemic. And the numbers are staggering. The numbers of people who died, about 70 million plus around the world, out of which 40 million alone in India. And so this is a completely kind of crazy period in Indian history, which surprisingly we don't really learn about much. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, of course, in the connection with pandemics, right? And that is, it's interesting because the British actually had to face several policy decisions, just as we had to face last year. So often these things, again, when we think of, last year, 2020, it was unprecedented. The migration crisis was not, it could not have been anticipated. What I want to leave you by the end of it is that actually these things have happened in the past. The same policy choices came up, very hard policy choices. Obviously, these are not simple policy choices. There are trade-offs involved. But it's interesting as to how certain events in the past have also kind of led to similar outcomes or completely different outcomes. Right? And in some sense, an appreciation of that history would have served us very well last year when it came to migration. But nevertheless, of course, I think a lot of this is now, it ought to be now in some sort of a pandemic management plan. The root, of course, is, why did we see so many people going back last year, right? And so I'm going to try and build this, talk into two segments. One is about understanding the nature of migration. And this is built on about a decade's worth of research, which started in Bangalore about in 2008 and culminated in the book released in 2018 called India Moving: A History of Migration, and then link it with the pandemics of the past, as well as, of course, COVID-19. And as Ajay pointed out, then kind of bring us to where we stand right now and what should be done so that in the future, if there's a pandemic, and if we have to have similar policy choices like a strict lockdown, how do we deal with migrant workers? So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So I'll start off with a presentation. I have some slides and I'd be happy to take questions at the end. So I think I have about half an hour to 40 minutes. Right. Can you see this, Ajay? Yeah. Okay. So this is what we saw last year. This is the pandemic coronavirus, COVID-19, which really zips around the world in very quick time. And by March, April, March end and April 2020 were horrendous times if you were in India, simply because if you switched on the television and saw the news channels, if you were reading the newspapers, and if you were walking on the streets, you would see horrendous sights like this. And you would see sights of migrant workers carrying their children, carrying whatever little belongings they had in the cities, going back home. Literally, I mean, it should be dubbed as some sort of a humanitarian crisis. It was quite horrific. But what's remarkable to me as a person doing history is that the same visuals that you see in 2020 were also seen in 1897. Now, can you see this, Ajay? I just want to point out.
Yeah. This is perfect.
This picture on the left as well, right? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So what I want to point out is in 1897, this is a picture from the Illustrated London News showing migrant workers from Bombay city fleeing Bombay. And if you just see the both these pictures in contrast, both are related with pandemics, both are related with migrant exodus, both kind of convey the sense of anxiety and grief that is writ large on the migrants' faces. In 1897 on Bombay Victoria's Terminus Station, an interesting phrase that was heard then was, "Agar marna hi hai to gaon mein marenge." And this was a phrase which was remarkably heard even last year. So what happened in 1897 in terms of how migrants felt about the pandemic was pretty much identical to what happened here. The difference, of course, between these two pictures is that in one picture you have the train, and in the other picture you don't have the train, right? Because arguably the migrant crisis essentially happened because the Indian Railways was shut down with a 4-hour notice period. Right? So in the sense, what we're seeing is one thing that we kind of observe, and this is true of all pandemics in the past, is that pandemics do lead to a natural sense of flight, right? Which means people have a tendency to abandon what they're doing and go back home in a time of a pandemic, which is quite a natural thing to do. All our families, were based around India. We wanted to go back home, but because of the lockdown, often we could not go back home. But the difference is that we decided to stay where we are for as long as we could. But the difference is that we could stay back where we are for as long as we could. And that ability to stay in the city for a certain amount of time without any government support is there because if you belong to the middle class or upper income class, you can do that. You have the financial security to do that. Nobody's going to kick you out of the house that you're staying in and so on. That is not the case when we start talking about lower income migrant workers. Right? So I'm starting this talk with these two pictures, two different pandemics, one plague related, one coronavirus. In the case of plague, half of Bombay fled. That is 400,000 people out of 800,000 people left, an estimated 400,000 people left the city. And just like we saw in the COVID case, most of these migrants returned in the sense that a lot of these migrants went back home, stayed out that particular pandemic period, and then came back 6 months. Now I'm going to come back to this picture right at the end to tell you about how the British actually thought through the lockdown decision. And I think it's a very important part of how we think through how do we curtail migration during a pandemic. But what I'll do now is talk a little less about pandemics and talk more about migration in general to build up this discussion about why the pandemic led to such sort of a reaction. And I'm going to start the story in the late 19th century. This is again a picture from the Illustrated London News, which shows you different modes of traveling in India. Right? And so migrants have kind of walked. They've taken elephants, they've taken camels, bullock carts, variety of modes of travel. But what happens in the late 19th century is that you have the Indian Railways, which comes about. And this panel was, of course, created by the British to celebrate the arrival of the railways. It kind of altered the notion of speed, altered the notion of distance and time in the Indian subcontinent. Now, the Indian Railways, what it does, it opens out many pockets of India. And it, in a way, starts also some of the most famous migration corridors of India. It is, of course, not the case that people used only the railways. People also used waterways and so on. But the railways kind of fundamentally, increased the ease at which migrants could operate at both ends, that is the destination and the source region, right? Because earlier, if you had to go from, say, Bihar to Calcutta, you would walk, or you would take, you would take some of these modes of travel, and it would take you weeks, if not months, to go back, which would mean you would stay back in Calcutta for a long period. And then if you went back home, again, you would have to walk for many, many weeks, and then you would reach home. What the railways did was that suddenly you could reach Calcutta in a matter of days, right, rather than weeks or months. So the railways was very important because suddenly you could maintain circularity, which is a huge part of the story here, circularity at very, very convenient levels for migrant workers. Right? And why I'm pointing out this, is that fundamentally the crisis last year was essentially linked with the Indian railways being shut down. Right? And the Indian railways being the lifeline of migrant workers now for 150 years is an important thing to consider before one shuts it down abruptly. All right, now what the railways did was actually stimulate what I call as the Great Indian Migration Wave. This is a chart showing sex ratios, female to male ratios in India. And I'll just talk about two districts which are very famous in India, Ratnagiri and Udupi. All of you know about the famous Udupi restaurants across India. All of you have heard of the Ratnagiri mangoes. But what's less known is the migration histories of these two districts. These two districts for more than 110 years, as you can see on this map, have never really had a sex ratio below 1,100 females to 1,000 males. Now, it's a remarkable statistic. This is the India line is below. What it's telling you, what this chart is telling you in one instance, is just what it's basically a reflection of is a mass male migration out of Ratnagiri and Udupi, such that these districts themselves are female surplus districts. Why? Because the men are out working in Bombay and other parts of it. Right? But it is not something which started 10 years back or 20 years back or 30 years back. The earliest I've been able to trace to for both of them is the late 19th century, which means we're talking about 100 years of persistent mass male migration. Right? And this is just two districts of India. My research shows that it's not just two districts of India, it's about 100, more than 100, actually, but close to 150 of India's 700 odd districts. So which are these districts of India? Right? And so I'm going to spend some time on this map now, because this is what I call as the Great Indian Migration Wave, is all these red shaded districts that you see on this map. And it's very important because last year's pandemic, when the Shramik trains eventually arrived, they were essentially going to these red shaded districts. Right? And these districts, I'm arguing, is not something which happened overnight. These districts have been around in India's migration consciousness for more than 100 years. Okay, so what is the data showing? What does the map show? It shows basically out migration. It shows the percentage of households in each district who has a migrant who has gone in search of work. Right? And so what we're saying is if a pandemic like COVID-19 came, essentially the kind of rationale to go back home was essentially coming from these districts. Why? Because these districts are home to India's massive circular migration economy. Right? And how many people are there? They're saying that overall, there are more than 100 million circular migrants in India. Right? So 100 million is the operative number for circular migrant workers in India, of which, of course, a lot of it is intrastate. So a lot of migration happens within state borders, right? But a substantial migration also happens interstate, right? Which is happening from one state to another. And of course, last year's lockdown affected both intrastate and interstate migration. So let me just take you through this map. Firstly, the three characteristics of the Great Indian Migration Wave. It is male dominated. Hence, the visuals that you saw last year, of course, it had women, but it was mostly men. It is semi-permanent, which means most of these migrants, actually, believe it or not, who come to our cities actually do not settle down. Like I showed you that chart on sex ratios, people are coming to our cities, but they're also going back. Right? So there's this continuous back and forth which is happening. So it's called semi-permanent. They are living for long periods in our cities, but they're never settling down. And third is that they are remittance-based, which means they come to the city to earn money and send it back home. Right? And so this is the three classic features, and this has been happening now for more than 100 years, which means what? If you're born in any of these red shaded districts, you kind of grow up in a culture of migration. You are in fact expected, if you're a boy or a man growing up in this household, you are expected that as you grow up, you will go out to earn a living, and also expected to eventually return. If you grow up as a woman in these households, in these places, you are expected to look after the land in the absence of the man. You're expected to look after the family in the absence of the husband. It is very, very strong migration cultures in these places. So I'll start with the most famous one, which is this cluster here in the Gangetic Plains, the eastern Uttar Pradesh, Bihar area, right? And a lot of this migration, of course, I've traced it to, very, very, it can go back many, many centuries for certain districts. But on the whole, it's the late 19th century, which really, the migration starts. And a lot of this is driven by British recruitment for its industries, for its plantations, often outside India. So this is not just a map of internal migration. It also shows you where people are going outside too. But the eastern UP Bihar is one of the world's largest labor pools and has remained so for more than 100 years. Now, earlier people from Bihar and eastern UP were going to Calcutta. They were going to these overseas plantations. Today, that geography has shifted. They're going to cities like Delhi, Surat, and Mumbai. Right? So Surat, Delhi, Mumbai are three cities which are very important on this particular scale. And of course, now they're going everywhere in India. Right? So you'll find a migrant from UP and Bihar virtually anywhere in India. The second big cluster is coastal Orissa. Right? And coastal Orissa, as you'll remember, came up on this map last year for COVID-19. And Ganjam district, in fact, was there even in the earlier map of the AIDS pandemic. Right? So if you consider AIDS to be a pandemic, Ganjam was also in the news for that. 100 years back, people from coastal Odisha would cross the Bay of Bengal and go to Rangoon and Burma. Today, they take a train often called the Puri-Okha Express, and they go all the way across India to Gujarat. Right? So most people from coastal Odisha today work in Gujarat. It's completely, it's a complete U-turn from where they were going 100 years later. What's interesting and fascinating is that the out-migration is unbroken for more than 100 years, but the destinations have changed. So earlier Burma, once the Burmese economy melted down, once they threw out the Indians, they found a new destination, and that was Gujarat. You come down the east coast and then you reach Tamil Nadu, which is India's relatively prosperous state. And you find that there are districts here like Sivaganga, which also send a lot of migrants out. Again, historically to Malaysia and so on, today to the Gulf and some other places within Tamil Nadu. And then, of course, you have almost the entire west coast, starting from Kanyakumari to pretty much Ratnagiri, which sends out people. So Kerala, for example, all of you know, has this huge connection with the Gulf economy. This is for about 30, 40 years. But even before that, Kerala was sending out men across India. And then if you reach Udupi as you go along the west coast, if you drive from Kanyakumari to Ratnagiri today, it's a lovely drive along the west coast. You will see two things. One is you'll see Western Union boards everywhere because this signifies the remittance economy. But the other thing you'll see is this constant lament of a shortage of labor. Why? Because a lot of people have gone outside. Again, because there's been a lot of upward mobility in these places because people have become rich by going to the Gulf and so on. These guys are not going to do the low-end jobs anymore. And that's why we now have a massive north to south migration. There are over 2 million North Indians, for instance, who work in Kerala. Right? So there are more than 2 million Keralites who work in the Gulf, but there are also more than 2 million North Indians who work in Kerala. So India's migration dynamics are quite unique. There's international immigration, there's in-migration, and there's also immigration to a certain extent along our borders. I'll take you to Gujarat, which is the state I'm belonging to right now. And you might think Gujarat is a state where everyone come to. And that's true partly. It's a net in-migration state. But it also has districts like Amreli, Porbandar, Bhavnagar, which are shaded red in this, which are high remittance receiving districts. So where are these people working? They're working in Surat, for instance, in the diamond polishing industry and sending back money home. Then you have Rajasthan, a lot of districts which are sending people to cities like Jaipur, Delhi, Ahmedabad, and so on. And then if you go north, you have the Himalayan economies, which is Uttarakhand and Himachal Pradesh. And if you include Nepal, there is an entire Himalayan belt, which we can call as a remittance economy, which is surviving on migrants' remittances. The Northeast is also there in this map, but not so much in comparison with the Eastern UP. And you'll see the bulk of central India is kind of locked out. Right? So not much of central India comes into this mass migration map. Of course, people are moving, but not in the same propensity. And then I've drawn 4 circles on this map to show seasonal migration. So this is where people move for extremely short-term jobs in some of the worst sectors of India, that is the brick kilns, very harsh kind of farm harvesting operations and so on. These are jobs, when I say seasonal migration, people are moving in spells for less than 6 months as compared to, say, the standard migrant worker. Think of the security guard on wherever you're living, in whichever building you're living. Think of the plumbers, the carpenters, the cooks, the grocery vendors. What we call as the urban informal economy is is pretty much semi-permanent migrant labor. But they're not seasonal. They're coming to the city for about 10 months. Right? Seasonal migration is much more short-term. So we say seasonal migration and semi-permanent migration make up what we call as circular migration, and that's 100 million. Now, how is this linked to pandemics? Let me give you a sense of how important it was to understand the nature of migration in India to get a sense of what happened during the pandemic. For instance, why is it that last year we saw a lot of activity from migrants, that is protests and a lot of exodus from cities like Delhi, Surat and Mumbai, but not so much from, say, Bangalore and Chennai? What is different between Mumbai, Surat, Delhi on one side and Bangalore and Chennai on the other side? It is the nature of migration to these cities. In Mumbai, Surat and Delhi, more than half the migrants come from rural areas. In Bangalore and Chennai, more than half the migrants, so for that matter, Hyderabad, more than half the migrants actually come from other urban areas, which means the nature and type of migration is completely different across even India's major cities. And so when the crisis struck, the first reaction, of course, of people was to go back home, because these are migrants who have very, very strong connection to their land back home or their villages back home. As I said, this particular cultural phrase, agar marna hai to gaon mein marenge. But the second thing is, of course, these migrants are living in much more precarious livelihoods, which means a shock like a lockdown suddenly kind of destroys the income earning opportunities. Many of them are daily wage workers. And so the kind of vulnerability of migrants in Mumbai, Surat and Delhi is much more on average than, say, in Hyderabad, in Bangalore, in Chennai. Having said that, of course, we saw exodus from all our major cities. So it's not just that these cities are affected, but I would argue that Delhi, Surat and Mumbai were more affected because of the nature of migrants in these. Now, this is just to juxtapose migration with urbanization, and you'll get a sense of where really the pandemic crisis happened. In fact, COVID-19 is remarkably well correlated with urbanization. There are a few handful of metros which dominate COVID-19 cases in India. It's the Delhi cluster, the Mumbai Pune cluster, the Chennai Bangalore cluster, and so on. Right, and that's because most epidemiologists are saying because of high density places enabling sort of virus spread and so on. Again, so you'll see that this map is kind of the inverse of this migration. So why are people migrating in the first place? And how do we characterize migration? The best way I feel to understand migration and the pandemic is to understand that the bulk of work-related migration in India is actually not permanent. Which means India is kind of unique among the class of countries around the world. See, all countries in the world have rural to urban migration. But India is a little bit more unique because we have a vast part of our rural-urban migration, which is circular, which means either seasonal or semi-permanent. And that's a huge factor as to why the response to the pandemic was so different in India with respect to other countries. Right? So people are keeping one foot in the village, one foot in the city. People look for social security in the village and economic security in the city. Okay, and I'll come back to this point later. What it also means is, why does this happen? Why are people not settling down in the cities? Why do they want to go back? There are many reasons for this. One is, of course, reasons at the destination end. Often migrants find cities very expensive, very difficult to get a hold in, and so they never really fully snap ties with the village. But there are also reasons from the source region side. For example, norms on gender. So women, for example, rarely move directly for work. Of course, most migrants in India are actually women because of marriage for migration. But apart from that, you'll find that there are certain norms in the source region which prevent women from moving to cities. So automatically what you get is a gendered migration. Think of the Gulf. Why do Keralites not settle down in the Gulf? It's a simple destination region factor. You cannot settle. The citizenship laws in the Gulf don't allow you to become a citizen, and hence you can never settle down there. So you're forced to become a circular migrant. Again, so there are a variety of reasons for migration. In India, broadly, longer term migrations are positively associated with caste rank, which means upper castes, upper ranking castes typically are more overrepresented in longer term migration streams, but underrepresented in shorter term migration streams. So there's a very neat relationship between the duration of migration and who can migrate for long time periods. Because in order to migrate and live in a city for a substantial period of time, you need to have some amount of capital, either physical capital or social capital. So that is why that's a particular relationship between caste and migration. Religion does not matter so much as region. The dominant kind of identity which matters in migration is region, which means it doesn't matter if you're Hindu or Muslim in Azamgarh district in Uttar Pradesh or in many districts in Kerala. Everyone across religions has kind of caught the migration bug, because you can see from others' success. When you go out, often you make money, you build a nice house. It's kind of a massive demonstration effect, which leads to more and more migration from those. And so why people migrate? Of course, the number one reason is wages. People are moving because they're expecting to get better wages. But there are also non-economic reasons as to why migrants come to our cities. The big thing, as Ambedkar famously pointed out, is the anonymity of the city. The fact that caste pressures are relatively lower, obviously they are not absent, but relatively lower in cities than in villages, means that often migrants choose to come to cities to get away actually from caste oppression in villages. There is also peer pressure, which means you see your friend going and so you're inspired to go, or you see your uncle is going there, so you decide to go with your uncle. And that's why a lot of migration in India happens through social networks. So out of that 100 million number, most of those migrants are actually going through social networks, which means you're going through friends and family, often of the same caste. But what's also important to note is that a certain part of our migration also happens through contractors. And that is a very important. I'm going to come back to this thing about what happened during the pandemic. The fact that especially our construction workers come through contractors is a huge part about what went wrong during the lockdown. Right? So contractors is an important way in which some migrants come to our cities. There's, of course, migration for marriage, a huge part for the reason for women. Education, massive reason. Transfer for bureaucrats and government officials. And of course, there are then forces which are driving people out. For example, if you ask a person from coastal Odisha, why are they migrating so much for 100 years? They will tell you a very simple reason, that about every 10 years in coastal Odisha, they have a super cyclone, not just a cyclone, but a super cyclone, right? Which means that this, what I call a cyclone psychology, means that it's a very natural tendency for people to seek out greener pastures outside, because you don't know how precarious livelihood is back home, right? So though we say migration is often volatile, you don't know if you'll get a job and so on, in many agrarian systems, it is a more stable livelihood strategy than what you can eke out back home, because you have floods, you have droughts, you have a cyclone, variety of kind of potential disasters which make living out there fairly tough. All right, so that's about migration. What I've tried to give so far is a broad picture of India's geography of migration, because that's going to be important when we start talking about pandemics. But now I'm going to take you a bit on the history of pandemics, right? Because as I said, this is not something new. 70 million people died worldwide due to pandemics. That's a number more than the 2 world wars of the 20th century put together. In India, 20 million people died in a few months of 1918. And that is more than the number of people who died in World War I across the world. So these are horrific numbers. And so a lot of what we're talking about today, whether it's vaccination, whether it is lockdowns, whether it is quarantines, curfews, all of this was talked about even then, including, of course, migration. And for example, even the law that we are using right now to handle the pandemic is called the Epidemic Diseases Act of 1897. Right? So we are actually using a lot of the stuff from the age of pandemics. Think of even vaccination. Adar Poonawalla, for instance, is now the hero of the vaccination story of the head of Serum Institute. This family was never into vaccination. They were horse breeders. but they would provide those kind of ingredients to something called as the Hafkin Institute. And the Hafkin Institute was set up during the age of pandemics. So even in the vaccination story, what we're providing, the next time you take your shot, and if it's from the Serum Institute, there's a clear link between the intellectual development of that and how it all started, thanks to Hafkin, who was working on cholera and plague during the age of pandemics. Right? So what happened last year is not unprecedented. The law that we're using is from the 1897. Many of our scientific breakthroughs, even the public health manuals, were written from this period. Right? So it's a very close link that we have to the age of pandemics. This is a period with exceptionally high mortality. Okay, 1918, just to put it in perspective, had a massive death rate. In November 1918, 200,000 Indians were dying every single day, not every month or every year, but every single day, 200,000 Indians were dying in November 1918. That is how horrific it was. To put a sense, COVID deaths so far have been about 150,000 or so, and we're saying 200,000 deaths per day. Right? So it was completely kind of a horrific time to live in. This is about plague, and I'll talk a little bit about plague. This is where plague affected, different regions. You'll see it affects, the Western Ghats and the Gangetic kind of valley more than other regions. And plague rarely affected, Madras and Eastern India. Now, why am I talking about this is to give a sense of some of the big puzzles that we see today. The biggest puzzle of COVID-19 is, why do some places have more COVID-19 mortality than others? And everyone has their pet hypothesis. There's one that what I would call as the Pani Puri hypothesis. That is, if you can have Pani Puri, you have great immunity to anything in the world. And this is some sort of kind of a logic which many people use in India. Of course, about 40 million Indians died due to pandemics. So it's not the case that Indians have some unusual survival instincts with pandemics. But what's amazing in this particular data I'm showing you right now is that South India and East India rarely got the plague. Right? And they were very happy. They said that we're doing a great job in pandemic management and so on. It turned out that when they figured out how plague was transmitted later on, which is basically a mechanism from rats to rat fleas to human beings, they realized the particular nature of rats and rat fleas were quite different in South India and East India. Right? And so there was a particular ecology of the disease which led to more deaths. Now, why am I talking this? Is because when you talk about migration, certain parts of India got more hit due to plague than others. But the British very quickly realized that a blanket policy which will affect all regions would not make sense. And this took time for them to evolve. Okay, what we would today call as localized lockdowns rather than a national lockdown. And because you don't know why COVID-19 even today, hurts more people in certain regions than others. It's still a bit of a mystery, and we're going to find out only in a few years down the line. So I'll come back now to this particular picture I started off with. And again, I've laid the context that what we looked at the circular migration, images last year were actually not unprecedented in the sense that people even fled back during earlier pandemics, right? But the difference, of course, was that as you see in this picture, there's a train, right? And there was no train last year. Now, you may be really surprised to know that the British actually had the same policy trade-offs to make as the Indian government last year. So what is this policy trade-off? You have to make a policy trade-off saying, do we shut down the railways or not, right? And the reason to shut down the railways is, of course, to stop the spread of the virus, right? And or the disease. And it's a very benevolent objective. That is, we save the rural areas in particular, which often has, very bad health facilities, from the disease reaching there. So let's keep the people where they are and let's handle the pandemic rather than let people move around and make the pandemic worse. So that's the classic epidemiologist recommendation of a lockdown, right? Now, what's interesting is that the British actually mulled over this decision: should we shut down the trains or not? And then, as they noted in their files, they said finally they took a decision to run special trains to ferry migrant workers back home, because even if they had lockdown, they reasoned that people would walk back home. This is a remarkable set of reasoning which happened that time, because, of course, it was borne out last year by what we did. But the British, of course, messed up on a variety of other fronts on pandemic management. But they had a much better sense of how India's migration economy looked like. Right? And their whole logic was, if we actually shut down the railways, people will walk back home, and that will be much more scattered. We will not really have a track of where people are going. And so in a way, we will make things much worse. Right? So here's a remarkable example from history of a concentrated choice, of a deliberate choice of you having special trains to ferry back workers. That is exactly what India did in 2020, but only 2 months late. Right? Remember, we also had our Shramik trains, which ferried back migrant workers. More than 6 million migrant workers were ferried back through Shramik trains in the month of May. But that happened 2 months late. Right? And in those 2 months, we got this horrific scenes of people walking back. There's another amazing incident from history in which the railways actually were shut down. This is also not true that the railways have never been shut down in the world to contain a pandemic. The plague was burning in China. 1911, a deadly medical scientists call as pneumonic plague had started. And this is an example of a protective costume, again, to show you that PPEs looked very similar to what we are doing now. And this is the image of a doctor in China trying to handle this plague outbreak. And what the Chinese authorities did was to shut down the railways for migrant workers. They said third class and fourth class tickets no longer available. And what they got was a full-blown humanitarian crisis, which was exactly what we saw last year in India. Right? And this was January 1911, peak winter. People walked back home and died because of the cold. So we actually have two incidences from history. One in which the railways was shut down and you got a humanitarian crisis in China, just like we had last year. And one in which the British actually mulled over the issue and decided to ferry special trains, which is exactly what we did, but 2 months late. So this is why we got this crazy crisis last year. And so if you want to ask this question, why did so many people go back? Hopefully, I've given you some elements of this answer to this question. One, there is a psychology of going back during a time of a crisis, especially health crisis. Right? As I said, this idea of agar marna hai to gaon mein marenge. But the most important point is that for most migrant workers in India, the city is a site of economic security and the village is a site of social security. Social security means not only your family, but the state's provisioning, which means you have access to ration, you have access to subsidized education, health, you have access to the welfare state in the source region, typically tied to your birthplace. The minute you're in a different city, the minute you're in a different state, your access to the welfare state is tremendously reduced. Why? Because we in India do not yet have what we call as portability of social security. And that is why when the lockdown was announced and when there was no communication in the lockdown speech for migrant workers in particular, there was nothing to kind of tell migrant workers, stay there. In fact, what the communication was saying, please don't go anywhere, stay at home. But the fact is that for most migrant workers in India, home is not the city, but the village. And when you say stay at home, actually, most migrants took it very literally and started going back. Now, they started going back for many other reasons. The big reason was, the lack of credibility of how long the lockdown would go for. Right? Because remember, initially it was for 3 weeks, then it kept getting extended. With every extension, there were different classes of migrants. There were some migrants who would not be able to survive in a city for more than a few days. These are the most precarious migrants in India. But I would say that the bulk of the migration, which happened, reverse migration, was not necessarily the poorest of the poor. These were migrants who could live in the city for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, but then realized after a point that this lockdown does not seem to be getting over anytime soon. And then the holding capacity of these migrants, maybe not a few days, but it is definitely not more than 1 month. And this is something to reflect upon, because what we're saying is that we have about 100 million circular migrant workers who cannot live in a city without an income, without landlords chasing down their necks for more than a few weeks. Right? And just contrast that with our own experiences, where we could live, for example, I'm in Ahmedabad, my parents live in Mumbai. We could live 10 months or a year without seeing each other, well connected. It is not really a bothersome exercise for us. Right? For tens of millions of migrant workers, it was very precarious. And so a lot of people actually ask this question, why can't these people stay here? Why are they going back? But the basic point is that if there's no income, how do you get food? And if you don't have a ration card, how do you access food? Now, all the welfare services started late. You'll remember that the state government started then these food camps. As per the government's own admission, there were 20,000 migrant camps set up in India and so on. All of this was actually unnecessary. If only, the government had done a very similar thing to what was done with international travel. International travelers around the world got some notice period. They got a 1 week notice period. Students in UK, for instance, got a 1 week notice period to go back home before announcing the lockdown. Even our shutdown of the airspace was very calibrated from about March 16 to March 24. Right? But with the railways, it came very abruptly. And I would argue that the railways, being the lifeline of India's migrant workers, its shutting down had also a massive psychological impact because people really did not know what to do without them. What we got then was, of course, massive unemployment. This is, people might think lockdown was just for a few weeks or a few months. Why should it impact so many people? The fact is that the minute the lockdown is announced, surveys like the CMI unemployment surveys tracked 1 in 4 Indians were out of a job, which also tells you how precarious India's labor is. Right? So you got this massive spike, 25% unemployment rates, in the peak month of April, May, and so on. Of course, it's fallen back. It's not yet fallen back to pre-pandemic levels, so it's still slightly higher, right? And which tells you that this problem is not fully over. But it just shows you as to how important that particular lockdown spike was for unemployment. So what do we learn then from a bit of history of migration, a bit of history of pandemics? One is, of course, that every pandemic requires some migration, and some migration has to be curtailed. And so nobody is saying that, don't have a lockdown and so on. But the question is, how do you do the lockdown and how do you kind of think through this? And so I would make a distinction between two major types of migration, which is international and intern. Right? And it is possible to quickly shut down international migration, right? Which is also credible. Why? Because once you shut down international migration, you just have to shut down your airports, shut down your water spaces. If you're stranded in London, no Indian migrant worker is going to swim from London to India. No Indian migrant worker is going to swim from Saudi Arabia or Dubai to India. Right? Which means it's a credible commitment. It's a credible way to shut down migration. And that is why countries like New Zealand, even most countries in the world, shut down their airspaces, but also that in a calibrated manner. Most countries gave certain time for people to go and then shut down. The problem is you can't do the same thing for internal migration. And that's because if you shut down internal migration, people can still walk, as we saw last year. Right? And so people can still walk from Mumbai to Bihar. They can cycle, as we saw a lot of people stole cycles or bought cycles and made this long journey. Right? So it's not the same thing. While you can shut down international airspace quickly, you can't shut down internal space. What we saw last year was migrants going to state borders. State borders were shut, but they would just walk down a few kilometers from the check naka, cross the state border because it's a porous border and come in. Right? And so that's how these millions of journeys were made last year, because you could walk back home if you had the intensity. You could essentially walk back. Now, that's not possible with international migration. So how should internal migration be curtailed? I would argue that at the onset of a pandemic, do what the British did and do what the Indian government did in May last year, have the Shramik trains and give the option for people to go back home. Right? This is exactly what we did in a way for international migrants. We should have done this for internal migrants. Then when you do announce this lockdown, have firstly, ideally a localized lockdown. But whenever you organize a lockdown, there has to be massive, massive communication to migrant workers because they are going to be the most affected people during a lockdown. Right? Which means that on 24th March, if the Prime Minister of India had hypothetically gone on stage and said, we understand that migrant workers are going to be affected and we are going to have completely free rations for the next 2 months. You can access food, water, whatever you want at any point in India, which is in a way de facto what happened, but that was out of force. If this is announced before, that would go a huge way in assuaging, a lot of the concerns on social sector. So what are the policy options? What the pandemic teaches us with respect to migration is that we have a problem on 3 counts. We have a problem that migrants can't access the government's services outside their place of birth. So what we say as the lack of portability of social security. And of course, one way in which this is planned to being resolved is this new One Nation, One Ration card scheme, which is on the cards. Right? And so this is hopefully going to solve some part of that issue. But it's not just rations, even healthcare. A lot of women go back home because they find it easier to access healthcare in the villages rather than cities and so on. The second thing that the pandemic, COVID-19 and migration crisis showed us was that far too many Indians live in very precarious living conditions, which means what we are saying is our housing policies, which have been focused on ownership-based, housing, has not created a vibrant rental housing market. And this rental housing market that exists is not really well regulated, right? Which means that people are living on contracts which don't exist on paper. And the landlord or landlady can just say, if you've not paid, get out of the house. A lot of people made the journey back home because they were asked to leave or really thrown out of the place that they were because they were not paying the rent for that particular month. Right? And so we need much better rental housing, need better oversight of rental housing. And finally, a lot of migrants were stuck in our cities because the contractors fled. The contractors often the only point of contact for migrant workers, often who don't speak the same language. For them, it's a completely new culture or kind of world that they enter when they come to different cities. And when the contractor flees, the employer does not know much about these migrants. The migrants were truly stuck. And so a lot of the migrants who went back last year also went back because they were fed up of living in the city without a contractor. So how do we enforce contractor accountability? One of the ways is for employers to know their workers better, going beyond the contract. And this applies to all of us. All of us in our various organizations now, have outsourced a lot of services, which means we are dealing with a contractor. And we need to start understanding our workforce in a much better way. All right, so I'm going to end here just by pointing out again that this thing about pandemics and migration, it is not quite unprecedented. Many of the things that we've seen, I think there's a lot to learn from history. I think there's a lot to learn from even last year's crisis. Hopefully, this should never happen again. But for that, we should stop forgetting our own sort of past and our own kind of public policy experiences. And that is why I think we should have like a manual on pandemic management, on which migration should be a huge part of that particular manual. Remembering that we had a completely unnecessary crisis last year. All right, so I'll end here with just a few slides on COVID-19. We know that the rich countries of the world are much more affected per capita. Just to show you where India is on this map, India. This is a chart by Angus Deaton, Nobel Prize winner. This is the left side chart compares mortality per capita with per capita income, and you'll see India is kind of in the middle range of the y-axis. Basically, if you're saying India is in the middle range, slightly on the bottom half of deaths per capita, which means there are a lot of countries doing better than us, a lot of countries doing worse than us. But on growth that is on GDP growth, you'll see India is really at the bottom end, right? Which means our harsh lockdown also has kind of knocked out the economy by a massive amount. And so that has a huge implication for, of course, informal labor and migrant workers. Just to again point out that the two worst years of Indian history have both been pandemic years. In 1918, GDP fell by 10%. In 2020, it's expected to fall by 8%. In both these years, a massive, massive impact on the lives of migrant workers. This is also a strange kind of time we're living in. If you look at what's happening with COVID-19, the mortality seems to be higher among men. That's what some scientific studies say. But the labor market impact seems to be higher among women. Right? And so a lot of studies which show how added sort of tasks have been, women have to do more tasks. While scientists say that this is an urban VIP virus, I quote a public health expert, the labor market impact. So the mortality impact of this pandemic and the labor market impact is quite different. But the huge part of that impact is on migrant workers. And so these are tough times for migrant workers across India. They are now slowly getting back to their jobs, just like 100 years back, they went back to Bombay. But the labor market in India is still in flux, and a lot of interesting things are happening out there. So I'll end here. These are the two books. One is on migration, one is on pandemics, and I hope you get the opportunity to read them. I also run a Twitter and Instagram handle called BizEconHist, which is on business and economic history. So with that, I'll end here and be happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chinmay. Really scholarly exposition of the problem we had. And we always at Manthan believe that academics like you will bring a kind of a fresh perspective, which we miss in our angst and worry about what's happening. I really like the way you brought history into the count. It is often said that history repeats itself, first as a tragedy and then as a farce. Uh, I think that the recent pandemic is a fine example of how government has reacted as a farce. But having said that, you brought a very interesting point that what did the British do in 1918? And they did not seem to be reacting the same way as we did now. And somewhere did we miss a sense of history there? And was it not well documented? Is it not? When the policymakers did not go back to research, did not have time, or were they in panic? These are some questions we all have.
Yeah.
My first question would only be that, so you did talk about migration last century, but in the hundreds of years of India, how come local population did not migrate out as much as we had migration in? I think the only two instances I can think of migration out is in West Indies and South Africa. What exactly was happening then, and how come we have more Turks, Iranians, Iraqis, Kazakhs, our Mughals? They're all migrated in. What happened then, and why did not India migrate out?
Great. So, first point on a sense of history. Like I said, one of the reasons I've written this book, and this book has been written in record time. Given a choice, I would have loved to. My first book took about 10 years to write, and this book has taken 10 months to write. So I would have loved to have more time and so on. But I really thought, there were a lot of things out here which had resonance, and that's why I thought I'll go for writing this book as quickly as possible. And one of the things that triggered me to write this book was this loss of memory. The fact that when the day I realized that I was going to write a book was pretty much this March 12th or March 11th, March 12th, when the WHO announced the word pandemic. So they declared that this is a pandemic. And there were crazy things going on saying India has never suffered from a pandemic. Many people are saying that. We have amazing diets which protect us from pandemics. There was a thing going on about, and then later in a few weeks, then the migration crisis happened. And I just thought to myself, as a person who works a lot in economics and history, that I've seen a lot of this before. That, in my PhD thesis, I had worked on migration history. I had written about influenza back then. Even in my first book, I've written about plague and cholera. So this thing about epidemics has been there, but it's been confined, I think, to a very narrow, research by medical historians, very specialized field, and it's not really been out there in the popular discourse. And I can tell you, Vikram, at least one person who apparently advised the Prime Minister or was on the team, told me in private saying, we wish we knew some of these things, which kind of tells you that, it really it's kind of slipped out of collective memory in a big way. The influenza, just think about it, 20 million Indians, dying, and in a few months. It is the greatest demographic shock ever received in India. And not a single line of it in our textbooks. And most people have not even heard of this, until this thing. We remember Jallianwala Bagh tragedy, April 1919. All of us know about this. And that's because there was a clear enemy. With pandemics, there's no clear enemy, and so kind of slips out of memory. So there's no doubt we need better this thing. And I think we should take a cue out of the British. The British, for all their faults, after every crisis, would have like an inquiry report. Right? They would have like a famine commission inquiry report, a labor commission inquiry report. And it's based on that kind of those reports that actually over time things became marginally better. Famines actually fell in India. After 1910s, you have very few famines apart from Bengal famine. But that's because the British actually invested in public works programs and everything after those horrendous famines of the late 19th century. So definitely, I think what we should do is really have a government task force on what happened during 2020. And how do we have a nice manual going forward? This thing about so this is a question on migration. When did India go from being a country of in-migration to out-migration? Well, firstly, I should point out that actually, believe it or not, India from about 1971 at least to 2001 was a country of net in-migration. Right? Why? Because we have migrants from Bangladesh and Nepal. Right? And because of the context of the 1970s refugee crisis and so on, actually those numbers were more than Indians going outside. So this idea that India is a country of net emigration is actually not true. It's right now on the margin. There are as many people going out as there are people coming in. Right? So India has all these, and that's what separates India from China. Like China, China and India have a lot of internal migration. China and India have a lot of emigration, but China has very little immigration. India has also immigration, right? So we have all these things going on. This thing about the people from Central Asia coming in my book, the first chapter actually talks about this. In fact, a lot of people call this Persians coming to India as the first brain drain. A lot of these painters, artists, calligraphers come into India. The first brain drain coming into India. I would say this. There are a couple of reasons. So of course, merchants, specific merchants, Gujarati traders and so on, have been along the east coast of Africa, Oman, this part of the Middle East for a long time. So I would say merchants have gone out, Indian merchants have gone out. But the numbers I give in my book is at any point of time in history, it's very hard to find, say, more than 100,000 Indians, at any given point out of the Indian subcontinent before, say, the middle of the 19th century. It's really the indentured migration to Mauritius, Fiji, that thing, which starts sending people abroad. And the biggest wave that happens is, between 1880 and 1920 to three countries, Burma, Malaysia, and Sri Lanka. This is the first time Indians are going out in large numbers. One of the things constraining international mobility was caste taboos. Right? And if you remember, if you look at Gandhi's autobiography or many of these freedom fighters who went to London to study, they had to kind of convey to their communities that, look, nothing will happen to me. I'm not going to be an outcast when I return. Because for a long time, we held this kind of cultural taboo that if you go outside, when you return, you're an outcast. That is this notion of losing caste upon return. So don't go outside. The Kala Pani, these were notions built on restricting mobility. And I think this was an important marker. So you could go within the subcontinent, but you can't cross the seven seas. And seven seas, different interpretation, whether it's seven rivers or seven seas. But this is one way to understand why maybe Indians did not go around the world before the British actively recruited them, before the middle of the 19th century. So that's one way. Now, why did those notions emerge? When did those notions emerge? Actually, fascinating questions of history. And I don't have, very, very specific answers, but it goes back at least to more than, 700, 800 years. This notion of losing caste upon return. And it's interesting that in the late 19th century, many of the workers who went on indentured migration, we tend to see indentured migration as, kind of slavery, very exploitative. But a lot of the workers went precisely to escape caste. So this notion of losing caste upon return for the lowest ranking caste was actually a boon, saying that actually we are anonymous when we go to Mauritius, we are anonymous when we go to Fiji. There's a whole literature on migration to Fiji, which says they're called the Jahaji Bhai. That is, once you're on the ship, caste doesn't matter. Right? And so a lot of people like that. And so they were choosing actively these migration networks because they were trying to get out of the caste system. So I think caste is an important way to look at, who could move. Because one of the things I'm arguing in my book is that yes, everyone has moved throughout history, the lowest ranking castes have a much restricted diaspora, or the geographical extent of the migration networks are much more limited than, say, the upper ranking castes. And so there are particular reasons. So I think that's one way to think of why Indians have not moved out until the middle of the 19th century. And of course, Hyderabad is a city which has got so many. I mean, you have this whole Turkish and Afghani. I think that's where you're coming from. This very particular, even Bombay, the city, Mumbai, as a city I was born in, has these a very, very cosmopolitan city with a lot of in-migration from different countries. And it's a bit sad that actually some of our cities are less cosmopolitan today than they were maybe 100 years back. But that might change. I think in about 50 years, hopefully, if India does well, then, again, people will start coming in and so on.
Lovely, Chinmay. This was absolutely fantastic. Thank you. I'm still trying to figure out about our, as a society, as a state, understanding of the migrant situation before the pandemic started. Did we really know that there were so many migrants? Did we know, as a society, as a state, did we know that there were so many migrants, that this problem is likely to come up? Or were we, uh, was the government and those who make policy living in a state where they were absolutely unclear of what would happen? How did this mishandling come about?
So it's a great question. I don't want to blame, I think from the government's perspective, it was a tough call. You to lock down quickly or not, and so on and so on. A particular decision was made, and arguably, if these migrants actually did carry the virus back home, and the virus was much deadlier than what it is now, maybe if the government had not locked down in the way it did, we might have been actually criticizing the government for not locking down, right? So there's always this hindsight bias in looking at policy performance. But I was very disappointed because I've been part of two efforts related with this government, in which we both documented scale and the issues. So I was a member of the working group on migration. This was instituted by the Ministry of what was then the Housing and Urban Poverty Alleviation. This was India's first policy draft on migration. 8 ministries coordinated with it, and some of us academics were also on that working group. And that report exists online, right? So, this is a classic case of a report existing, but nobody really paying attention to it. And we had pointed out all these things: the scale, the lack of portability of social security. This is a government, and this was 2016. This is in the Modi government era, of which a policy was. The report does exist, and I contribute a little to that. And then in 2016-17, I also contributed to the chapter in the Economic Survey of India, which for the first time quantified migration. And we pointed out, again, more than 100 million circular migrant workers. This was under when Dr. Arvind Subramanian was the chief economic. So both the scale and the issues were well known. In the sense that, and that report had got some media traction as well. So my sense is that maybe this is a hypothesis, that I think the advice came mostly from the medical community. And I think the standard operating procedure there is, how do you curtail a pandemic, is to lock down. That is, spread, stop people movement. But I think not enough people knew about what this would do for migrants. So I think that was a weak link, and hopefully this doesn't happen again. But hopefully the government acknowledges that this was quite a mistake.
There's a question here on
Sure.
On internal migration, and you did point out that why some states have a higher migration rate than the other states. Do you see this changing in the next 30 years, 50 years? Do you see these trends reverse?
Of course, one would like to see it change. Like I end my book by saying, will we see Maharashtrian migrants in Bihar and not vice versa? Will we see a Shiv Sena-like political party in Bihar, shunning out Maharashtrian migrants? The big movement we know for sure is north to south, right? Why? Because of the demographic differences, the economic differences. So that's a given, that in our lifetimes, the biggest migration story is going to be from North India to South India. Historically, people went to West, East, Punjab also. But now the major belt, that is Bihar, UP, Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, and so on, the major incomes are in the South. Earlier, there was a linguistic divide, right? Which means people would not come from the north to south because the language was different. So you would go to Hindi-speaking states. Today, the wage difference is much higher than this linguistic divide, in the sense that you don't mind learning Tamil as a Bihari worker as long as you're getting 6 times more wage. And so that's one clearly identifiable mass migration wave, which has already started. As I mentioned, 2 million North Indians, Kerala, and so on. Will certain states, so if you look at the 100-year map and say the last 30 years, what has changed? One state which was historically not so much in the migration map and has now become a major part of the out-migration story is West Bengal. So West Bengal, so there are districts in West Bengal which were historically not on the out-migration map, but today districts like Medinipur, etc., huge out-migration, right? And so that's become this new belt of out-migration. The in-migration would be the major cities. Right? And so it's basically a question of which are the big cities that are going to emerge. And Bangalore and Hyderabad are only going to make it much larger. Who knows? And so maybe the answer to Vikram's thing is, one way to understand the changing dynamics is to predict which would be the largest cities of India 50 years down the line. And if today if the top 8 are Mumbai, Delhi, Mumbai, Calcutta, and then, Madras, Hyderabad, Bangalore, Pune, and so on. My sense is that the migration to the south is going to intensify, and it could well be the case that in 30 years down the line, the pecking order is going to be, Delhi, Mumbai, and then Bangalore, Hyderabad, maybe even Pune, Chennai, and Calcutta nowhere on the map. So Calcutta is nowhere on the map because of not only of migration but fertility. Fertility rates have crashed, so birth rates are very low. So there is going to be reordering. And there'll also be some cities like Surat, which was not on the map in 1970, but now it's the top 10 city of India in terms of population. And so there'll be certain cities like Surat, Tirupur, the migrant clusters, the industrial migrant clusters, which will also become very big. But I would just say the only thing we can say with some certainty is that the north to south migration story is just going to intensify because the demographic difference and the income difference are so clear, and they are not going to, close out very quickly. In our life, in the next 40 years, this is going to continue. And the out-migration places will continue. The one state where out-migration rates will fall will be Kerala. Right? And so, like this paradox which I often convey in talks on migration is that India's poorest state, which is Bihar, and India's richest state, which is Kerala, on many indicators, they have the same rates of out-migration. Right? So it's not like, if Bihar becomes Kerala, it will take about 40 years for Bihar to become Kerala. There's no guarantee that out-migration will stop. Right? Because underlying Bihar and Kerala is density. They're both states with extremely high rural population density. So the out-migration will stop eventually when the pressure on the land eases. And that will ease only when birth rates collapse to a point when there are hardly any people coming on that. And so Kerala is on that other end of the demographic transition. So Kerala, we're going to see migration rates fall for the purely demographic reason of very low birth rates. That is known, we are 50 years away on Bihar on that. So Bihar and UP, and this has implications for policy because a lot of people said last year, reverse migration, this is a great opportunity for Bihar to now invest so that people don't have to move out and all. This is just impractical. We should let migration happen. There is simply not enough. You can't do much on agriculture to support those kind of densities. And so, let people move out and find the most productive jobs wherever they can. Right? And so so it might seem counterintuitive because people say, don't you want to develop so that people don't want to go out? But I often say, look at Kerala. Kerala is one of the most developed parts of India on almost every indicator. And one in five of the labor force are in the Gulf. So migration is about aspirations, about so many other things. And so eventually these migration numbers will go out only when India is at the bottom edge of the demographic transition. I should also point out UK. A lot of people think UK is a country of immigration, which it is. But in the last 25 years or 30 years, there have also been times when UK was a country of net emigration because the British would go to South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, and so on. So migration dynamics are very, very peculiar. It's not a given that rich countries have in-migration, poor countries have out-migration. There's so many very interesting dynamics there. As I said, India, for about 30 years was a country of in-migration, which goes against every theory. Because if you look at per capita income, India is not very rich, so India should be a country of net emigration. But India is a country of net immigration for such a long time. And that's because those particular border states were richer than Bangladesh and Nepal. Now, as Bangladesh is becoming rich, it's in fact, by some accounts, richer than India now. Who knows, as I was saying, last year during that whole CA thing, maybe in 10 years, if you're asking me what's going to happen in the future, maybe in 10 or 20 years, Indians will be moving to Bangladesh, because Bangladesh is growing so spectacularly. And the Bangladesh will have to be mulling over a CA kind of a law or something like that. So you never know how migration pans out.
One question, Chinmay, is the next pandemic is certain to happen. We don't know when it will happen. How prepared are we as a society?
That's the thing. I would say if you saw the response to COVID-19, some of the best responses came from countries which were recently affected by pandemics. Right? And that's why the memory is very important. Right? And so, for example, Kerala started off very well on COVID-19. Why? Because they had the Nipah virus in 2018. So the health minister, that entire team knew what to do. They knew this whole contact tracing and all, which is completely alien for a lot of state governments in India. Look at Vietnam, look at China. They had the SARS, swine flu to a certain extent. these are pandemics of the last 20 years, which affected some. So they knew what to do. They knew quickly wear the masks. So the society was kind of trained. So that's why I say, for the next 20 years, we kind of know now. We know the migrant worker thing we should avoid and so on. The thing is, what happens once the generation goes out, right? And that is the challenge, because this recent memory is simple. Kerala, Vietnam, China, but it's this old. Our last major pandemic we're saying was 1918 in this thing way. And I mean, I'll tell you how memory works. So 1918 happened. Before that, there was a flu pandemic also in 1890. In 1957, a leading doctor from Bombay wrote a letter to the editor saying that this flu pandemic, there was a pandemic in 1957 which affected East Asia. So in 1957, he wrote a letter to the newspaper saying, we have to be on guard. We have lived through 1918. We know the horrors a pandemic can do. Please take action. Now, it so happened that not much action was taken, but we kind of got lucky. The pandemic didn't really arrive and, kind of fizzled out. And so we kind of survived this 1957 and 1968 flu pandemics quite likely. But that memory quickly faded, and so by the time the next scare then was the 1994 plague outbreak, Surat. All of us remember that. And in a way, there was some sort of interesting response to that plague because people said that, India was ravaged by plague many years back. But there was still some medical officials who had seen plague. And that's important because plague was eradicated in India only in 1969. So while we say pandemic intensity kind of waned, it was still around. So there were medical officials in 1994 who had still seen 1940s, 50s, 60s and were around. So that is why I think we need to not only write books, but, maybe inculcate this more in our basic textbooks, like our history textbooks, and kind of just like how we have wars and variety of other things there. We know about world wars and so on. Maybe pandemics should also be seen as a class of events in history, which should be part of basic curriculums. That's how I think you kind of make it part of a very basic level of consciousness. And every pandemic has some quirk, some unique aspect about it. And as I end my book on pandemics, there are 4 stages of a pandemic. It starts off with denial. The second stage is confusion. Third stage is acceptance. And fourth stage is erasure. And so we started off with denial, in Feb, Trump came to Ahmedabad, mass packed stadium. And then there was this whole confusion for 2 months. There's kind of gradual acceptance. And historically, we have erased the memory. And so our challenge is not to do that. Our challenge is to keep this experience that we have learned alive. And so the countries which have not erased have been in less denial mode the next time around because the cycle keeps happening. Denial, confusion, acceptance, erasure.
Having seen this out migration in the pandemic, do you see these migrant workers coming back at any time in the same numbers? Is it likely to? I'm assuming there'll be no further pandemic in the near term.
Yeah, I think the broad trend of more and more rural to urban migration is irreversible, pandemic or not, right? This is the natural logic of economic development. It's happened not only across the world, but across states of India. Tamil Nadu is almost 50% urban. Bihar is only 10% urban. So within Tamil Nadu, people have made this move towards cities and so on. So this is irreversible. A lot of people say work from home has changed, migration dynamics. I don't think it is going to change it so much. Yes, there could be certain changes, but this general movement from villages to cities is, going to go is going to only intensify. In the immediate short term, I think there will be at least a few migrants for whom the psychological scar has been so great that they'll say, to hell with these people, I'm never going to go back. But again, the overriding concern, they were in the city in the first place for the money. And that has not changed in the sense. And what we're getting from field accounts is similar. After a few weeks of the return, the family members said, okay, what are you doing here? You're the breadwinner of the house. You can't be here. You have to go back and earn for us. And so my sense of the labor market, Vikram, is that it's not fully back to normal in the sense that there are sectors which are still experiencing shortages and so on. But it will soon be back to normal and much more, which means people will start coming back. So I don't think the pandemic has fundamentally reversed our migration story. I don't think it has fundamentally changed. I don't think work from home is going to fundamentally change the migration story either. Because this class of migrant workers cannot actually work from home. plumbers, electricians, carpenters. You need a physical interface. It's impossible. Cooks, you can teach someone cooking, but if you have a cook at home, then you need the person to come. And so a huge class of the migrant workers in India need to be at the work sites. They can't work.
But we can cook numbers working from home.
True.
There's another question here saying that our economy is heavily dependent on the reverse migration of our labor force. So would this Atmanirbhar Bharat and decentralization of heavy industrial cities help uniform the migration profile and reduce contact spreading?
Yeah, my sense is our densities are very high in both rural and urban areas, right? But much more in urban areas. So my sense is, there's not going to be much of an effect of either Atmanirbhar or many of these things in fundamentally changing the spatial logic of industry's location choice or migration. My sense is, where companies set up in India is hugely governed by the sector. So IT company in Bangalore, for instance, or not really like, Atmanirbhar, but tax rules, right? The company sets it up in Uttarakhand because there's a 10-year tax holiday on excise or something like that. Right? So it's basically tax rules and the sector specificity that kind of drives location choices of firms. And so my short answer is no. I don't think there's going to be much of an impact of, Atmanirbhar or many of these policies. See, the big question on migration has always been, there are two questions. One is, should we even have migration? In the sense, shouldn't we be developing rural areas so that nobody has to leave? Right? And this is the classic Gandhian logic, as I call it. Point is, it's inevitable. Right? There is really no society in the world which has become more rural over time. The arc is one way. It is more urban. It is not more. There is no country which has actually de-urbanized substantially over a long period of time, especially in the modern era. So that arc is inevitable. So that's the first question. That is, should we have migration? But then what the question was hinting to is, should there be migration to the big cities which already seemed at breaking point, or should it be towards the smaller towns? Right? So can't we move our migration to a more balanced form? So can't we have many more cities which are growing rather than just having Bangalore or Hyderabad and so on? And a lot of people point to China, which has 100 large cities and so on. My sense of that is that kind of happens automatically. So, for example, a lot of people have left Mumbai. Why? Because Mumbai is ridiculously expensive. It doesn't really offer you a great quality of life anymore. And so there's a natural kind of what we call as diseconomies of agglomeration, and people start moving to different centers. But the tendency to agglomerate is huge. And so that is why people flock to Chennai, Hyderabad, Bangalore, and so on. And education does a lot of that. The more educated you are, the more likely you are going to be staying in not only a city, but a big city of it. I actually teach a course called Urban Economics. So this is a question very close to my heart. And what we observe at the IIMs or any higher education institution, we get 400 students every year. These are 400 students drawn from virtually different districts of India. Right? They're giving the CAT exam and they come out here. So 400 students, they come from, say, 300 districts of India. And they all get jobs in literally 4 cities. Right? So this is what we're saying. We're getting people from all over India and putting them in 4 cities, Bangalore, Hyderabad, Chennai, and say Bombay, Delhi, 5 cities. Right? So this is what education does. The more educated you are, your preference also then becomes not just urban living, but big city living. And so that is why one has to integrate, these choices. But I also say that on migration, often our views are quite patronizing. So we say, there's been too much migration, so we should stop migration to our cities. Too many people have come. Right? We forget that we ourselves are, migrants or descendants of migrants. And the second thing, let us have many, many smaller cities so that people don't have to come to the big city. But the question I pose back is, then you go there. You work in a smaller city. But all of us seem to have a tendency to also, choose the big city. So we have to ask ourselves, why do we, like to migrate? Why do we like to sit in big cities? And those will give you the answers as to why the average person is also thinking the same.
Okay. Yes.
Before we close, one question or two. You had a lovely chart in your presentation about how the rich countries were affected much more than the poorer countries. Has there been an understanding of why that happens?
Yeah, that's the biggest question of COVID-19. And Siddhartha Mukherjee, I would highly recommend reading this article by Siddhartha Mukherjee in the New Yorker. I think that kind of puts together, all the, broadly comes down to three things: demographic structure, underreporting, and what scientists would call as cross-reactive immunity. Right? But cross-reactive immunity is very different from what people in India talk about, or what I call the Pani Puri hypothesis. Right? This is the classic thing that, think about it. Very clean countries, very hygienic countries like Japan, Australia, South Korea have lower COVID-19 mortality per capita than India. Right? So it's a big mystery. And the way I look at it is we are still in the phase of the plague pandemic between 1898 and 1905, where nobody had a clue as to what was driving plague. Right? And people had their own hypotheses. Plague is because of air, impure air. Plague is because of filth. Plague is because of poisonous gases coming from the soil. This was the most popular theory back then. In fact, the first British Commission report in India knocked down the idea of rats and rat fleas, which was a hypothesis of a guy called Simon. And so then what happened was, point out, a person born in Secunderabad, a person called Liston, he's part of the Indian Medical Service, but he was born in Secunderabad. He kind of got attracted by this hypothesis of rats and rat fleas of Simon. And he said, let me build onto it. And he did a lot of research over the next 7 years. And finally, kind of in a paper in the Indian Medical Gazette, the Secunderabad born person basically said, it's actually, plague is not about poisonous gases or anything. It's about rats, rat fleas, and humans. And when the rats die, the rat fleas get hungry and then they bite humans, and that's how plague gets transmitted. It was a very elegant theory. Preposterous at that time in 1898. But once that happened, everyone realized the elegance of that theory, and that became now the leading theory of plague. Now, of course, even then, people didn't know, why some parts of India was. So there's always some amount of unexplained kind of phenomenon. But the core reason then was rats and rat fleas. And I do think we have still not really hit upon the core of COVID-19 mortality, right? And there's so many interesting hypotheses out there. One is the hygiene hypothesis, that the more filthy the place, the better the immunity you have. Now, you should know that obviously this doesn't make sense, because if we had such great immunity, why do we have higher death rates, higher morbidity rates, and so on, right? So why is, or maybe you can say it helps us against COVID-19 and nothing else. We still have tuberculosis and everything else.
Yeah.
So there's some sort of weird thing about, and that is what they call as cross-reactive immunity. But I was also, in the world of hypothesis, the air conditioning hypothesis. This is a hypothesis which says that because these Western countries have much higher uptake of air conditioning systems, the kind of virus spread was much more efficient. And so the viral load seems to be much higher in many of these countries than in countries like ours, which don't really use much of air conditioning. Interesting hypothesis, And so I think we'll really get to know in a few years. But definitely we should not go out and say that, we know for sure that, Indians are not dying in as much propensity as the Americans because we eat pani puri. I think that's very lazy logic.
Absolutely. Exposition. I'm enjoying this. Actually, Manthan, we used to have physical meetings, and now we are virtual online. Whenever we have physical meetings, I hope you'll temporarily migrate and come back to Hyderabad.
Sure. I used to work in Hyderabad for 2 years, so I love Hyderabad. Yeah. Any opportunity to come, I will come.
Yeah. Ajay.
There's a last question. How come nobody mentions the AIDS pandemic today?
Yeah, that's a good question. For the simple reason that AIDS was often what's the difference between endemic, epidemic, and pandemic? The three mix of diseases. A lot of people are saying that this pandemic might become endemic in certain. So cholera, for example, was endemic in Eastern India. It's been noted in Eastern India for centuries. But after 1817, it became unusually virulent. It broke out in epidemic form. And today we characterize it as a pandemic because it went around the world. Right? And so that's why we say endemic cholera from Eastern India became epidemic in India and pandemic around. So plague has often been considered to be a pandemic. Influenza very quickly becomes a pandemic and so on. AIDS is also a pandemic. Why? Because there's been transmission and across the world, right? And AIDS has been registered in virtually every country of the world. But it is slow moving. And that is why it is not classically considered to be the kind of pandemic as we saw in cholera, where it could move from one place to another very quickly, or plague or influenza. Viruses like influenza or COVID-19, they can move around the world in weeks. Right? AIDS has taken about 30 million people, 30 million lives. That's a large toll, but it took about 30 years to take those lives. And it kind of seeped into the society. It's very, very gradual. So that's the only thing. That's why we don't classically bracket AIDS with COVID-19 or the flu pandemic of 1918. It's because of the speed of the pandemic. Right? And it's a sexually transmitted diseases. It takes that much more time. It's not just by pure contagion. And the difference between that and now is you can characterize pandemics by virulence and mortality, or what we call as case mortality ratio. Right? AIDS had a very high case mortality ratio. That is, if you got AIDS, very high chance that you would die. But the virulence, or what you call as the transmission rate, was very low. Right? With something like COVID-19, the transmission rate is very high. The case mortality rate is very low. We're saying 1 to 2%. Right? Plague's case mortality ratio is 80%. Cholera was more than 50%, but they were less virulent. So that is why pandemics can be characterized by by different ways. And I think the classic way is case mortality ratio and transmission rates. And AIDS belongs to one of those pandemics which had a very low transmission rate, right? But a very high case mortality ratio. And that is why we don't typically talk about it. But of course, people in the health circles know. I mean, we still have NACO, and this was the whole thing. And I should tell you, there are lessons from the AIDS, especially when we talk about migration. Because a lot of the focus on AIDS realized that some of the principal carriers of AIDS were migrant workers, right? Why? Because they were male migrant workers living in our cities and often taking AIDS back because they were visiting brothels and a variety of places. So, for example, Ganjam district, which was in the news for COVID-19, it's a major source region for migrants, was always in the news for HIV, right? So it became a huge HIV center kind of focus 20 years back. So there's a connection also between migration and AIDS. Is truck drivers, another classic sort of high risk group, which are also migrant workers. So there was a clear connection between migration and AIDS. It's just that we're not talking of it as a pandemic anymore, purely because of the nature of the pandemic, of it being slow moving. But in my book, I do touch upon AIDS like in a few lines, so it's not completely absent. But you're absolutely right that AIDS is still around, but the other thing is, of course, that people have kind of understood how to live with AIDS. So in the sense that the longevity of, even if you get AIDS, now you can live for many more years. And so that's also reduced the intensity of the disease.
It is something which could have been stopped if China was more transparent and accountable.
It's a great point. I put this in my book. In fact, I start this chapter. I'm going to read out this quote because you'll be amazed at this quote. This last chapter of mine is called COVID-19 in the rearview mirror. And I start with a quote from the Arthashastra. And the Arthashastra, as you know, is treaties written at least 1800 years back in India. And Kautilya's Arthashastra says this: any doctor who is called to a house to treat a severely wounded person or one suffering from unwholesome food or drink shall report the fact to the Gopa and the Sthanika. If he makes a report, he shall not be accused of any crime. If he does not, he shall be charged with the same offense which he helped to conceal. It's an injunction of the Arthashastra that you better take medical feedback very seriously, and you don't kind of go after doctors. You never try and hide epidemic-related information. It's there in the Arthashastra, right? It's a remarkable kind of injunction. And I start this chapter by saying, maybe the Chinese should have been reading the Arthashastra rather than the Art of War. In the sense of, it's a play on the Chinese response. But there's no doubt, Dr. Li Wenliang died. He was trying to tell the medical community that this is something strange, and he died of the virus, and he was censored by the Chinese state. So there is a strong case to be made that the Chinese did try to cover up the first outbreak. But the fact is that it got to the WHO very quickly, in the sense, December 31st. That's why it's called COVID-19, by the way, and not COVID-20. It came on the last day of 2019 on the WHO desk. That's a trivia for the day. Why COVID-19? Why not COVID-20? But it got to WHO quite quickly, right? And so the question is, Did the Chinese do something wrong in trying to cover up? Absolutely. I think there's no doubt about it. But if they had been more transparent about it, would this pandemic have not gone up the way? I don't think so, because I think the response was so tardy across the world. I mean, think of Donald Trump. Think of the governments across the world completely discounted the pandemic, which means that suppose this Dr. Li Wenliang had said something, the Chinese took it seriously. They reported to WHO maybe 1 week earlier, 2 weeks later. They're saying the world woke up really after Italy. The world did not wake up after China. They woke up after Italy. So this thing about how much of the fault to lay on the Chinese, the fact that there was a cover up, yes, but is it because of that we got a pandemic? I don't think so, because I think it's also the tardy response around the world which also got you the transmission across. So I wouldn't blame the Chinese entirely, but in my book I do specifically mention this case of Dr. Li Wenliang and the fact of this cover up. And of course, the Indian government response. I think there's also a question out here: how do you rate the government's response and so on? Compared to the Americans and the Brazilians, it's great that we never really dissed the science. I think the Prime Minister of India was very clear that this is something serious. Did not make fun of the Brazilian president making fun of the virus and so on. None of that happened in India. I think we were very strong on the science front for most. So that's a great thing of what we did. I think the fact that we decided to lock down at a certain stage was also very important. But I think the question was on the migration. That is a zero. I mean, it's a clear zero ranking. I mean, if you have tens of millions of people walking back home for more than hundreds of kilometers, that's a disaster. I mean, that you cannot call it anything else. I think one has to be very blunt in calling it out as a complete disaster. So there were certain good things. The vaccination stuff is amazing. I think every day you read not the fact that we're not taking the vaccine, but the fact that we're exporting and this great vaccine diplomacy, as it's called. I think it's fantastic for India's image building effort. So that's a great thing that the government has done, I think, and it's been very smart about it. So there are obviously a lot of good things to be said about the government. But on migration, I'm going to be very blunt and say it was a disaster. The follow-up to that is, why did the BJP win the Bihar elections? They got a huge mandate in Bihar, and Bihar migrant workers were very upset. And I'll tell you why. This is my hypothesis. The ire on the migration crisis very quickly shifted from the central government to state governments, right? And so for the Bihari migrant worker, it was not Mr. Narendra Modi's fault. It was Nitish Kumar's fault that he was not opening the doors of Bihar to them. Because remember, what very quickly became a central government decision then became a state government decision, whether to accept your migrants back or not. And there was different response across it. So West Bengal opened out much earlier than Bihar. So the ire of migrant workers were directed more towards the state government responses. Right? And that is why Nitish Kumar's party actually got trounced. He's back as chief minister, but his vote share, his party got hit. And I would say that was a huge part because of the migration crisis. So it's funny because the decision was at the central level, but the perception of this very quickly became a state government thing. Right? And so that is why, because the migrants in Gujarat had to deal with the Gujarat state government. So they were very angry with the Gujarat state government. The migrants in Bombay had to deal with the Maharashtra state government, which is not BJP in that state. So they were angry with that. So it became it was not necessarily an anti-Modi thing. It became an anti-state government politics. That's the way I see the connection between the migration crisis and the political fallout. I think there has been a political fallout, but it's been at the state government.